This is Stephen Ujifusa, and this is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast. One of the heroes of Barons of the Sea, which I wrote in 2018, was the Nova Scotian immigrant Donald McKay, also pronounced Mackay, who was born in 1810 in Nova Scotia, the son of a shipbuilder, and eventually immigrated to New York City as a teenager, where he apprenticed himself to a East River shipbuilder and worked his way up and eventually became a master shipbuilder and then started his own shipyard in East Boston. He worked for a client named Enoch Train, who ran the famed train line of packet ships between Boston and Liverpool. Eventually, he began building clipper ships of his own, and his most famous, arguably, was the Great Republic of 1853. This was the largest clipper ship ever built. She was 335 feet long, weighed in at around 4,500 registered tons, had four masts. She was a clipper bark, meaning that her fourth mast was rigged fore and aft, and the forward three masts were rigged with square sails. And she was built totally on speculation based on Donald McKay's shipyard earnings. No ship owner or client would touch this massive vessel. And this was a masterpiece. He poured everything he knew into this vessel. And a lot of people looked at this thing with askance. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was overly ambitious. But Donald McKay was very determined. He was nothing if not stubborn. And this was his masterpiece. And I'd like to read a section of Barons of the Sea, which deals with the construction of this masterpiece, the Great Republic, which was named after his adopted country. Donald McKay was a very patriotic adopted American, and ultimately the tragic fate that befell the Great Republic just before her maiden voyage to Australia. At the stroke of noon, shipyard supervisor Captain Alden Gifford stood in front of the Great Republic's prow, her bowsprit and screaming eagle figurehead looming up in front of him. From her main truck flew a blue coach whip pennant, as well as a white flag bearing the arms of the United States. An American flag adorned each of her masts. To complete the festive ensemble, a Union Jack streamed from a staff mounted on her bowsprit. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Boston's most celebrated poet, then read aloud his poem, The Building of a Ship, to the assembled crowd. It closed with the following stanzas. Sail on, nor fear to breast the sea. Our hearts, our hopes are all with thee. Our hearts, our hopes, our prayers, our tears, our faith triumphant o'er our fears, are all with thee, are all with thee. Captain Gifford then picked up a glass bottle, now filled with Lake Cotuichet water piped to Boston via the new aqueduct, and smashed it against the hull. The glass shattered, and the exploding water flashed in the sunlight. On board, McKay felt a jolt, and the horizon started to move. The tallow launching ways began to smoke as Great Republic picked up speed and hit the water. A huge wave crested up and broke onto the shore. Finally, the ship came to a halt, held back by a web of hemp cords. The crowds cheered and cannons boomed across Boston Harbor. Great Republic was afloat. Great Republic launched at 12 o'clock, which was successfully and beautifully done, Robert Bennett Forbes proudly noted in his diary. The ship has the Forbes rig and is about 4,000 tons measurement. 2 months of work remained before Great Republic was ready to be towed to New York. There were masts and spars to be raised, rigging to be hung, and lavish interiors to be fitted out. The ship's 38-foot beam gave McKay's interior designers a generous floor plate to create a true floating palace that matched the finest Collins transatlantic steamers in luxury. Visitors who came aboard marveled at the gleaming mahogany paneling and wainscoting in the main saloon. Tufted velvet sofas and stained glass windows adorned the public rooms and passenger staterooms. For the crew, the nasty, cramped forecastle was a thing of the past. There was enough room on board for a crew library stocked with books on seamanship. Prominent visitors streamed into the shipyard to see the beautiful and imposing clipper at her fitting out berth, as her foremasts rose one by one. Forbes returned to the shipyard, at this time with his children, among them 16-year-old Robert Jr., whom he had left behind as an infant during his 1838-40 trip to Canton. Shipbuilding had progressed by leaps and bounds in the past 2 decades, and Great Republic was the shining exemplar of America's role in a technological revolution. As for Donald McKay, he was anticipating the day when he would stand on her quarterdeck and see his company's Black Eagle ensign flapping overhead as his masterpiece barreled ahead under full press of sail, past the gates of New York Harbor, into the great Atlantic beyond. Captain Nathaniel Palmer journeyed down from his native Stonington, Connecticut, to take a look at McKay's maritime marvel. In the 2 years since his well-earned retirement, Captain Nat had been living the life of a gentleman yachtsman. From a white Italianate mansion on Long Island Sound, he spent his time racing a series of swift boats for pleasure rather than profit. Now, gazing up at Great Republic's vast bulk, Palmer was nonplussed. The old man grunted that McKay was a brilliant artist but had a poor understanding of maritime economics. The great China merchant Abbott Lowe joined Palmer in inspecting the ship. "She's beautiful enough to burst your heart," Palmer reportedly told Lowe, "but there aren't winds enough on this planet for her. What was this farmer's lad from Nova Scotia thinking of, sailing her to the moon?" It was estimated, perhaps by Palmer, that Great Republic would cost an astounding $10,000 a month to operate. Little did Nathaniel Palmer and Lowe know that before long they would be the proud owners of this greatest ship in the world. All had not gone well during construction. McKay and his brother Lachlan apparently clashed over the amount of sail the massive ship would be carrying. Still, after several weeks of fitting out, the steam tugboat R.B. Forbes towed Great Republic out of Boston Harbor. Her destination, Peck Slip at the foot of South Street in New York. The great ship's sails remained tightly furled. Over the next several days, Great Republic was loaded with thousands of tons of grain, as well as tools, provisions, and dry goods, worth a grand total of about $350,000. The governor of New York came aboard to marvel at McKay's latest creation, as did politicians, prominent businessmen, and thousands of ordinary New Yorkers. Captain Lachlan McKay's orders: sail Great Republic to Liverpool under the McKay House flag. There, Donald McKay hoped, he could sell her and her cargo to a British shipping company. Yet apparently it was clear that even when fully loaded with cargo and provisions, she could not carry all of her sails and spars, full rig, as designed. "I saw with regret," Captain McKay wrote his brother, when too late, that the ship could not carry her topgallants aloft when laden. Less sail area almost certainly meant a reduction in speed. A few days before her scheduled departure, a buyer stepped forward and offered McKay the unprecedented sum of $280,000 for the ship. The offer may have raised McKay's confidence in the value of Great Republic, yet the sum would still represent a loss of an estimated $20,000 from the cost of building the ship. He turned it down. The day after Christmas, 1853, final preparations were made. The crew climbed aloft and unfurled all of her sails below the royals. Great Republic strained hard at her lines in the breeze, ready to break free. Meanwhile, New Yorkers enjoyed a day of rest. Uptown in Bryant Park, at the intersection of 6th Avenue and 42nd Street, visitors strolled through the glass and cast iron concourse of New York's own Crystal Palace, inspired by the one built a few years before in London, poking amidst the exhibits and curiosities brought in for a New World's Fair, the exhibition of industry of all nations earlier in the year. This included clocks, daguerreotype cameras, printing presses, and an early Singer sewing machine. The exhibition's most important display, the hoist machine, which would not be ready for several months. A young inventor named Elisha Otis would manipulate a series of levers connected to a cable and a set of wheels to raise a platform up and down. If the cable broke, a spring mechanism would prevent the platform from plunging to the ground. It was to become the world's first safe and practical elevator. Those who wanted to take in a play could go to the National Theater and watch a stage production of Uncle Tom's Cabin, based on Harriet Beecher Stowe's provocative abolitionist novel. Those seeking something less controversial could stroll over to Barnum's American Museum on Broadway, ostensibly to be educated but more likely to be amused by novelties such as a flea circus, or disgusted by the much ballyhooed Fiji mermaid, a fishtail sewed to the mummified torso of a monkey. Among the living curiosities Phineas Taylor Barnum advertised that day included giraffes, and the Bearded Lady, which could be viewed without extra charge. Singing and dancing acts such as Hot Corn, Faint Heart, and Major Jones have been singularly adapted to the current holiday. As the temperature plummeted, homeowners stoked their hearths and stoves. The acrid bite of coal and wood smoke filled the chilly winter air. That day, E. Merriam of the New York Daily Tribune also warned all firemen, "The cold has come and may be severe, and during its continuance fires may break out, and difficulty may be found in the use of leather hose from the actions of the frost." The best solution to this problem, Merriam continued, was for the fire department to provide barrels of brine. 2 decades earlier, most of New York's commercial district had been wiped out in a devastating fire on the night that the temperature fell to 17 degrees below zero. 500 buildings were destroyed in the blaze, including the New York Stock Exchange, and in response to this disaster, the city had built arguably the most advanced municipal water system in the world. Yet despite this measure, cold weather still remained the New York water system's Achilles heel, and on this night, the fire department failed to place any barrels of brine on the street corners. Fires were a common occurrence in a city heated by open fires and lit by tallow candles and whale oil lamps. Usually, they were put out by a few pails of water or by tossing the burning furniture into the street. Otherwise, the alarm was sounded, and volunteer firefighters, wearing their colorful uniforms, raced to the scene in their gaudy red horse-drawn engines. Night fell, and the temperature dropped below freezing. Aboard Great Republic, the crew members slumbered in their bunks, resting up for one last day of work before sailing. A pot-bellied coal stove in the forecastle kept them warm. Up on deck, the night watchman paced the ship's vast empty decks, his oil lantern flickering on the white pine planking. Moonlight streamed into darkened saloons and staterooms, ready to receive the ship's first passengers. Thousands of sacks of American grain, most of it floated down the Erie Canal from the nation's fertile interior, sat in her holds. All of this bounty was bound for Australia to feed the hungry prospectors searching for gold. Just after midnight, on December 27th, flames leapt out of the windows of the E. Treble & Sons Novelty Bakery at 242 Front Street, far downtown. The fire was most likely caused by an unattended oven. A gale blowing from the northwest fanned the flames until they consumed the entire structure. Then, pushed on by the bitterly cold winds, the blaze jumped from one building to the next, heading straight towards the warehouses and piers of South Street. A reporter from the New York Times arrived on the scene, as did firefighters from several volunteer companies in the area. The flames were still extending in every direction, the journalist wrote in his first dispatch, all efforts to get it underway having failed. A general alarm is now being sounded, and engines from all quarters of the city are hastening to the scene of the disaster. Their efforts were all in vain. The horses pulling the fire engines skidded on the icy cobblestones. The water froze in the leather hoses. The conflagration devoured a provision store, a coppersmith and a bell foundry, a clothing store, the Fourth Ward political headquarters, and a boarding house occupied by a large number of poor families. The reporter then looked toward the East River and saw something even more terrifying. One by one, the masts of the ships docked on South Street were catching fire. Sparks from the burning buildings had landed on the hemp ropes and furled canvas sails of the packet ship Joseph Walker and the clipper ships Red Rover and White Squall, setting them ablaze. Soon each ship had become a fiery torch, their burning masts and spars towering 100 or more feet in the air, lighting up the night sky with a bright orange glow. A ship on fire is at any time a grand scene, the Times wrote, but the appearance is remarkable when contrasted with the dark sky of early morning. The crowd milling around the waterfront then turned their eyes to the biggest ship of them all, Donald McKay's Great Republic. Her mainmast was one of the tallest objects in Manhattan, towering 215 feet, about 20 stories above the main deck. One by one, each of her 4 masts caught fire, dropping flaming canvas and hemp onto her decks. Captain Laughlin McKay rushed out of his cabin, looked up at the conflagration, and realized that the only way to save the ship was to cut down the masts so they landed in the water. Then, somehow, he had to get a steam-powered vessel to tow her out into the East River, away from South Street. The spray of the fire engines could barely reach the main yards of Great Republic. No firefighter volunteered to climb up into the rigging. It would be suicide. Captain McKay quickly consulted with one of the ship's underwriters, who had rushed to the scene. He then ordered the crew to hack away at the stays that secured each of the four masts. First, the foremasts and the four topmasts came crashing down like blazing trees, sending up clouds of hissing steam as they toppled into the East River. Then came the main and jiggermasts. Yet McKay had miscalculated. A tangled mass of burning spars missed the water and fell onto the ship itself, flattening deck houses, smashing the steam engine, piercing 3 decks and igniting a fire in the hold. Clouds of thick smoke began to billow from its cargo hatches. Those still on board Great Republic ran for their lives. The fire is still raging with unabated violence, the Times correspondent wrote at 3 o'clock in the morning. The sparks and the burning cinders are falling in showers upon the piers between Peck Slip and Catherine Ferry. The mammoth clipper, the Great Republic, is on fire and will in all probability be totally destroyed. There was only one thing left to do. Captain McKay ordered Great Republic deliberately sunk at her berth. Blazing from end to end, the giantess sank 10 feet into the swirling East River. The winter dawn revealed the smoldering hulks of dozens of burnt-out buildings, their brick sides caked with ice from the futile efforts of the firefighters. Great Republic continued to burn for 2 days until the river quenched the flames. Miraculously, the great eagle figurehead, with blazing eyes and protruding tongue, survived the conflagration. It poked grotesquely above the lapping waters, just beneath the blackened stump of the bowsprit. A telegraph line had linked Boston and New York for the past 5 years, so Donald McKay received news of the disaster by the early morning of December 27th. Numb with shock, he paced the halls of his Eagle Hill home at sunrise, holding the telegram in his hands. His masterpiece was being consumed. Donald and Mary McKay were already in mourning this Christmas season. Their 2-year-old son, Lachlan, had died from meningitis only 2 months earlier. Now, in the darkest hours of his career, Donald McKay must have taken some comfort in his wife's love and support, even if he didn't express it at the time. The following day, McKay took the boat to New York, where he viewed the smoldering wreckage of Great Republic. There, according to grandson Richard, he realized that all possible had been done to save his ship. Donald returned to Boston to work on the Australian clippers commissioned by James Baines in Liverpool, determined not to be idle despite the calamity which had befallen him. The underwriters met and awarded Donald McKay $235,000 for the lost ship. As part of his gamble, and to save money on underwriting fees, he had insured Great Republic for $65,000 less than she was worth. He had no choice but to accept the judgment. Neither did he have much interest in rebuilding the ship. The underwriters put the wreck of the giantess up for sale to the highest bidder. Conservative to the end, Abiel Abbott Lowe saw his chance for a bargain. He purchased Great Republic where she lay. He then called Captain Nathaniel Palmer out of retirement for the biggest challenge of his career, rebuilding Great Republic into the finest and fastest vessel flying the House of Lowe. Thus ends the story of the destruction of the great clipper ship, Great Republic, one of the great tragedies or unknowns of American maritime history is that we would never know how fast the Great Republic could have sailed as originally built. The firm of A.A. Lowe & Brothers rebuilt the Great Republic as a significantly smaller 3-masted vessel, and she sailed successfully around the world for about 20 years or so. But she never sailed as Donald McKay had originally designed her. Donald McKay would continue building great wooden ships until the 1870s when he was forced out of business, a victim of changing times and changing economics when America's wooden shipbuilding industry collapsed and America turned its economic interests to railroads and expansion into the American Midwest rather than setting sail on the high seas. This is Stephen Ujifusa, and this is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast.